This is Debra B. Wilson. I am in Limerick. It is Wednesday, the 14th of August, 2019, and the time is 1900 hours and 34 minutes, and that's Irish time. I think that's BST. Okay. I've just ruined my credibility. Irish time. I'm in Ireland. That's the time it is. That's the time in Ireland. So, I've been working in my head about what I want this podcast to be about. And after I did a tweet, which I will post in the podcast, I know. If you've listened to any of my previous podcasts, you know that I've spent decades and decades in London, England. And there came a time in which I was doing feminist activism. There came a time in my feminist activism post 9/11, specifically the invasion of Iraq, that my activism became a journey of the analysis of extremism that was emerging in the country. Specifically, I was looking at London, that was my scope, but nationwide I was interested, and the way in which the security model, so that would be SO15 and MI5, responded to it. The terrorism police or counterterrorism police. I belong to several feminist organizations I was doing the research on my own, then the feminist organizations reached out to me. They were doing the same type of research. I thought it was actually just something I was doing. And then in time, SO15 reached out to me and asked if I wouldn't mind sharing my research, which I did. All of it was transparent. Everybody I talked to and interviewed knew that my research was being shared with the state in the form of SO15. So that leads me to a couple of paths I'm going to go down with this podcast today. So I was looking on Twitter, and this is a stream of consciousness, and I'm going to name a few people as I go through making a point and trying to pull together these different tangent and trajectories that are going through my head and bring them together. So I was looking at a post from Sean Bailey on Twitter, and the post is from the 12th of August. Sean Bailey is candidate for London Mayor, London Assembly Member, Honorable Colonel Cadets for the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, and then he's a conservative. So I can't vote in the UK, so the people I mentioned, I don't have political allegiance with one way or the other. They're people that have sparked something. Their comments, their work, their goals, their ideology. I've tried to paint a picture, and in painting a picture, and when I'm doing my research, I'm looking at multiple different things to come to an idea, or to facilitate the path to getting to an idea or an understanding. So Sean talks about, and I'm quoting, "I'm very concerned for our young people. They constantly tell me that just a wrong look and lives are in danger. I want them to feel protected and safe. How can they focus on progressing in life if they are always looking over their shoulder?" So, and this is to do with youth crime, knife crimes. So I'm going to post the link to Sean's Twitter account. Next, I am looking at the research work of Professor Fiona DeLandris, and there's also, this is a collaborative with Lydia Morgan and Jessie Blackburn. All three women are professors. And the research is accountability and review in the counter-terrorist state. And the position they take is, as the UK goes from conflict to conflict, it's fair to say, and you read for yourself, but that's the conclusion that I come up to, is that the UK is best described as a counter-terrorist state, that it goes from one conflict to the other, defending itself. What do they both have in common? Is the ways in which, in the case of the research project, it's how the state responds to feeling perpetually under attack. And then from Mr. Bailey's Twitter post, it's how some young people feel, bottom-up perspective, about feeling unsafe and the perpetual potential of being under attack. So when the terrain changed from the Troubles, from the perspective of British citizens, to now something that was happening from their fellow citizens, the way it manifested itself was, for some, as I said, feminist organizations, they began looking at, from a feminist perspective, through a feminist lens, of why this extremism was emerging and how and why the state was addressing it the way in which the state did. It was all under the name of social cohesion, and I always wondered why that was the case. I met some Israelis that asked me once they knew what I was doing in the UK, the research work I was doing, and they asked me what did I call what I was doing, and I remembered laughing and saying, giggling and saying, well, it referred to it as social cohesion work, and that's the way it's referred to in the United Kingdom. And he said, it was a man, he said, well, I suppose security modeling, counterterrorism work does, if it's done right, it leads to social cohesion. Certainly, it calms things down to allow for social cohesion to grow and exist. And I remember I said, security modeling, counterterrorism work, and he said, well, aren't you looking at extremists, what they're doing, and trying to define why they're doing it, and then why the state is responding the way in which the state is responding? And I said, yes, that's what I'm doing. And he said, well, that's counterterrorism, national security modeling. And I remember mentioning the conversation to some women in London, England. It was interesting. We all defined ourselves as feminists, but I don't think any of us thought we were doing national security modeling or counterterrorism work. But I would argue we were. And another interesting thing that came out during that time is that I wasn't the only civilian. The state was curious about the work and our findings, what we were doing. And so the state reached out to me and other people, women's groups and other women. And some people in the United Kingdom began to believe that feminist organizations were tools of the state. Now, I have no idea who or what was a tool of the state, but I know what my activism was, which was autonomously emerging and autonomous and self-guided. My activism was self-directed. The groups I was a part of, they were also autonomous and self-defining. But in some cases, the state did ask, what are you seeing? I've, for recent years, from an intellectual perspective and on a personal note, I've wondered, why did the women's groups get labeled tools of the state? And I think sometimes, I think I've come to the conclusion that there might be some sexism involved in that. I think people still find it difficult to believe that women, civilian women might be concerned about their personal safety, and that concern might go beyond fretting to look at the systemic reasons why you're concerned about your personal safety and what the state is doing or not doing and why. I think I've done a podcast on who we deem worthy of keeping us safe, and I sometimes think some of the narratives and the discussions around what women's activism, who and what we are when we question national security modeling, and it's concluded that we're a tool of the state. The state uses all kinds of tools, so I certainly can't speak for feminist activism. Each and every feminist organization that emerges that questions the safety and threat levels in the United Kingdom, but I can attest to my work and the work of other women, and I wonder why it's been mislabeled. I also wonder why, as a feminist and working with other feminist activists, we never labeled the work as what it was. I agree with the Israeli gentleman. It was national security modeling. It was counterterrorism work done from a bottom-up perspective. I grew up in a neighborhood, which is why I found Sean Bailey's comment, his post, so interesting. I'm 61 years old, and the neighborhood is called Woodlawn. It's in Chicago, and the model of the gangs changed. He talks about, I'm much older than he is. He talks about when he was young, the gangs seemed to be separate. They were separate, and the way they were run when I was young by Jeff Fort. It was very much a part of the community, but its own thing, off to itself. And when he was arrested, well, actually before that, there were fights over territories. These gangs make loads and loads of money selling drugs, and people are always fighting for territory. So there was violence, a great deal of violence. I'm certainly not looking back at the past through rose-colored glasses, but definitely when he was arrested and imprisoned, the leadership splintered, and the hierarchical order that he had in place no longer existed. So there was a perpetual fight between the foot soldiers, for lack of a better way of putting it, for territory, and it was nothing short of a bloodbath. So I know what it's like to grow up in a community that even if you're not involved, you are involved, because the simple task of going to and from work is fraught with fear. Catching a bus, scheduling the bus, wondering if the Chicago Transit Authority that runs the bus will bypass your neighborhood because of shooting. I know that fear, and I know what emerges from communities. Some of the fear can be stifling for some people, and some of that fear can produce an activism to address the violence that's around them. So, as again, like I said, I'm looking at all these things and trying to paint a picture. So when I think about the feminist activism in the United Kingdom and what has emerged, and places England, which I know of, and then I look in places like north of Ireland, which very little research, the awareness of the research and the works of women in north of Ireland and how they responded to the Troubles. People seem to be oblivious to that. And so I question why women have been cast in this role that for some reason we're just non-active participants in the journey of life, and why we wouldn't have the wherewithal, the curiosity, the intellect to question why is this violence happening around us, and why is the state, and questioning the ways in which the state is addressing it. It was never my life's planned to end up doing anything with SO15 until very recently. I was still calling them by the name they no longer exist under, Special Branch. My experience with Special Branch was in the north. I lived in Dundalk. I was engaged to someone in Dundalk, and I think it's fair to say that wasn't a kumbaya time for any of the participants. And so when I returned to my travels in London, my concern was I didn't want to get dragged into anything to do with the Troubles. So when Special Branch approached me, that was my initial concern. They never asked me anything about the Troubles. They did ask me about extremism that was emerging post-invasion of Iraq, which of course is post-9/11. And I know the work that I and other women did. I know the questioning I did of the state. I know my research which I shared with SO15 included questioning of why they were doing things a particular way. So as I continue my research in the United Kingdom that takes me near and far, and I continue to look at the ways in which the United Kingdom structures itself around matters of security to keep safe, and how individuals and collective groups of civilians respond to both threat levels to their personal security, aka national security, and the ways in which and how individuals, civilians, and groups of individuals, that organize in civil society, respond to the ways in which states keep us safe, the national security model. I'm glad I came across the feminism in the United Kingdom, the feminism that I was already engaged in. I'm glad that there was a space, and continues to be a space in the United Kingdom, and for civilian women, academics, researchers, to ask and question what the state is doing. It's not something that I would, no offense, but it's not something that I normally want on my agenda. I don't know what I would say. I don't know if I would say glad, but it was interesting when I wrote MI5 letters criticizing them, that their response was to meet with them for lunch, a meal, which I did meet with someone, a woman. I met with two MI5 officers on two separate occasions. Like I said, I'm certainly not naive enough or childish enough to say to you, put MI5 on your lunch roster. It's a fun thing. No, I know what MI5 is. I know what they're tasked to do. But I nevertheless, it's a country in which what I did and everyone else did in my neighborhood, most people did in my neighborhood of Woodlawn. How do we survive this when the police are not always as protective of us as they should? So how do we survive and progress with our lives? How do we keep our lives being stopped by the violence of others? Again, reaching back and thinking of the post and the different sources that are the impetus for this podcast. The concern Sean Bailey has for young people, well, young and old, in my community. We wanted our lives. We wanted to continue with our lives. So we did local, city, community-based security modeling to keep ourselves safe. We worked together. We reached out to the police to ask for more policing. We reached out to our aldermen, to our elected officials, to City Hall, to the mayor. I'm glad that I found a place that my natural, well, for everyone, the natural desire for self-preservation, to live, to thrive, to grow was that I did find a space that was not impeded by gender narratives. SO15, the counterterrorism police, are who and what they are. My belief about, because I've met amongst others, but in the United Kingdom, I've met the spies who have acknowledged who they are. I've met MI5 and SO15. You recruit a certain way to get people that can do those jobs. They're smart, they're clever, they are taught to be covert. So my opinion is they need a tremendous amount of oversight. They need support from the state. They need the state to understand what they're doing. They need the state to respect what they're doing. I think when people do their jobs well, with proportionality, and are respectful of the people they are tasked to serve, that would be us, the public, we have no other recourse but to be equally as respectful to them. Nevertheless, I still realize who and what these people are, again, and what they're tasked to do. But I want to say that I'm glad I found a country in which there is a place and a space for me to ask, what are you doing and why are you doing it? I am glad that I'm in a country in which I can follow on Twitter and reach out to a myriad of different people and organizations. They don't always necessarily respond, but I can reach out to a plethora of people and ask questions. I'm glad I'm in a country in which I can reach out to people from different countries and seek to learn from them, from the state perspective, what's available to the public about their respective national security models, as well as from the academics, as well as from civil society. So I'm glad I'm in a country that has never boxed me in and said, you're a woman or you're a black woman. I am glad that I am in a country in which I can be angry at the internal spying agency and send off a series of letters, and their response is, we'll sit down and talk to us about it. MI5, SO15, and all the rest of them are who and what they are. I'm not naive. But I continue to learn and grow about who I am, the work I have done in the United Kingdom, the work I will continue to do in the United Kingdom, the research work I will continue to do, my further education that I will do in the United Kingdom. And I'm glad I found this place and space. And I'm glad the places and spaces exist for me and allow me to work toward my goals. So this is a bit of a ramble as I'm pulling all of these things together. It's the way my brain works. And this is Debra V. Wilson. I'm in Limerick, and I'm looking forward to doing more traveling in Ireland. It's Dundalk was a place I called home, and to see different parts of the country. So I'm looking forward to coming back and going to Dublin again. I used to live in Dublin, and I lived on the outskirts of Dublin, and so but that's more rambling. Anyway, I've got to wrap up this podcast and then do all the posting, and thank you for listening.